Okay, so let's have a look at First Death in Nova Scotia by Elizabeth Bishop. It's um it's not my favorite Bishop poem. In fact, I would. It's very, very, very unusual for me not to like a poem. I'm a bit of a. I can always find I'll always find something in a poem that'll grab me, and there are interesting aspects to this poem. But when you compare this, if I'm thinking about the 10 Bishop poems that are prescribed for study, this is my like number 10 in terms of most interesting. It doesn't have the emotional power and the imagination of the prodigal. It doesn't have the subtlety and the nuance of the armadillo, the originality and the energy of the fish, the humor and the wit and the suspense of Filling Station. Um, the emotional integrity and incredible inventiveness and discipline of Sestina. When I'm thinking about Bishop, those are the poems I'm always thinking of. When I'm thinking about writing about Bishop and I'm thinking about the kind of questions I could ask on her, like I go to Sestina, I go to the Prodigal, I go to Filling Station, I go to the Fish, I go to the Armadillo, I go to Questions of Travel, I go to In the Waiting Room, which is a difficult enough poem, but it's really interesting. And the three poems that I don't really go to are At the Fish Houses, which is a bit complicated and very, very, very descriptive. There's a detailed note on At the Fish Houses in your Bishop notes. I'm not going to record an analysis of it, but there's a detailed analysis of it there. And The Bite, which I probably at some stage will record an analysis of. But anyway, this is, as I say, it's not a bad poem. It just doesn't do it for me, man. But anyway, let's get into it. Let's get into the analysis because some of you will be studying it. Some of you really like it. And some people like pineapples on pizza, and I don't. So I think it's important to note that, like all Bishop poems, this is an autobiographical poem. It is a deeply reflective, so a thoughtful poem. Reflective means thoughtful, but it's reflective as well in kind of a more literal sense, i.e., she's looking back on a childhood event. So the event is the death of her cousin Arthur. And of course, when she says first death, she's talking about like her first experience of loss when she was a child. And Nova Scotia is a place in Canada where she spent some of her formative years. If you know anything about Bishop, you'll know that from a very early age, she had a kind of a an itinerant life. She was moved from place to place, from being cared for by her aunt and uncle to her grandparents, and she went to boarding school, and so she had this kind of lack of. She had always had a sense of she never had any roots, any really place to call home. And again, if you think about the prodigal, you think about Filling Station in particular, those two poems, but also Sestina, you'll know why that is, and you know that the roots of that, how all that that's that angst and that search for home were lie in the fact that this is not the first death that she encountered in her life. That the first death she encountered in her life was actually the death of her father when she was far too young to be conscious of it or aware of it. She was only a babe in arms. She was not yet 1 year old when her father, a very young man, tragically died, took ill, and died suddenly. So it's interesting to me that in this poem she's thinking about a child. She's almost taking this um, helicopter view. This poem, as usual, is a narrative. Bishop is a narrative poet, much in the same way Heaney is, and to an extent in some poems, Nick Quillinan is, to an extent in some poems, Tracy K. Smith, although less so. Paul Amin, you know, a lot of these poets, they take a narrative approach. They create characters, they create settings, they create atmosphere, they tell stories in their poems, and through those narratives, they explore their thematic concerns. So this is definitely a narrative poem. It's got a very distinctive scenario and setting. But um, the core of the poem is about innocence, and it's about childhood, but also it's about change. And it's about that thing that happens to us when we're kids, where we suddenly, not, I suppose suddenly is the wrong word, when there's a moment where we become more aware. We become more aware of the reality of the world. And it's a difficult, uh, if you like, to excuse the cliche, coming of age, when we become aware of things like mortality and death. And I think that's what's explored in the poem. But I think there's an underlying fascination with death here, because, of course, if there was a seminal moment in Elizabeth Bishop's life, It was a death, just not the death of her cousin Arthur, it was the death of her father. So when we think of Bishop and we're thinking of aspects of style, she's a poet who uses repetition a lot. You see repetition in this poem. She's a poet who's famously, detailed. She pays forensic and meticulous attention to detail, using those details like a painter uses a paintbrush to build an image, stroke by stroke, detail by detail, and the result is very immersive poetry. So the opening stanza, let's have a look at it. In the cold, cold parlour, my mother laid out Arthur. Beneath the chromographs, Edward, Prince of Wales, with Princess Alexandria, and King George and Queen Mary. Below them on the table stood a stuffed loon, shot and stuffed by Uncle Arthur, Arthur's father. It's an unusual opening. So first of all, the repetition of cold captures the atmosphere. The parlour is the front room. And I think the repetition of cold is to emphasize, to emphasize the reality of the temperature in the room. But I think that there's cold temperature and then there's cold emotional. And I think that Bishop very much, if you look at Sestina, you can see a connection. I always try to think about connections between poems. If you look at Sestina, you'll see a connection between this poem and Sestina, where the idea that like there's a river of emotion, there's a huge swell of emotion, but it's suppressed. She grew up in a culture where you didn't really talk about emotion. So she's a child and she's in the parlour and it's cold, cold. And her mother has this job to do. Her mother lays out Arthur. And you have this juxtaposition between the profound. I'm using big words now. Don't like that. I don't like that, Paul. What does juxtaposition mean? This contrast between the profound and the ridiculous. Because we have this image of a child's body being laid out by her mother, but then young Bishop, she's just looking around at kind of these strange things on the walls. Nova Scotia is in Canada, and in the 1940s, when the memory in the poem is from the late 1930s, early 1940s. It would be the 30s. Anyway, Canada is a British member of the British Commonwealth, and the head of state in Britain is today in 2025 is the British King. Sorry, in Canada is the British King. And in the 1930s, when this poem was set, the royal family, the British royal family, were still very important people in the culture, the Canadian culture, which was kind of alien to Bishop, who was American. She lived in the northeastern United States, but she was American. So we have her aware of things being different back then. She doesn't call the images photographs, she calls them chromographs. And that's typical of her, paying attention to detail, capturing the truth of the situation, that this was a different time. This was a time in the past. And just the use of that word establishes that. And then this list, typical Bishop again list, Edward, Prince of Wales, Princess Alexandria, King George and Queen Mary. And we get the sense that the child is like, her cousin has died. It's a terrible tragedy. But she doesn't really understand it because she's a child. She doesn't really understand the gravity of it. So she's kind of looking up and she's fascinated by these images on the wall. And then her eye is drawn to the stuffed loon. Now, of course, when it comes to learning, quotes Paul, what should I learn? What should I learn? I think the first line in the cold, cold parlour, my mother laid out Arthur, or this first couplet, that's a good quote to learn. I think this one here, the stuffed loon, shot and stuffed by Uncle Arthur, Arthur's father. I think that's a good quote. But I just think if you knew about the repetition of cold, cold, and you knew the image of the loon, just even that word loon. And I don't know whether or not Bishop is playing here. I like to think she is. She was a woman of great humour and wit. But a loon, there is such a bird as a loon. Come on. That's a loon. Okay? And they were often hunted in the way people hunted ducks. And this loon, this bird has been shot. And look at the little baba. This loon has been shot by her Uncle Arthur because, that's what people did. It was a hunting culture. Bishop herself was a hunter. She was an outdoors woman. She was very much, that was part of who she was. But the child is looking, and in the room there's this bird which is dead but looks like it's alive because it's been stuffed, and she's looking at it, and she has this kind of ridiculous observation that the bird had been shot and stuffed, and stuffed is there twice. Don't forget, there's more repetition. So there has to be a symbolism. That has to be symbolically important, that repetition. But the loon itself is a symbol. And you have to think about what it's a symbol of. And it's there, it's standing on a table, or standing as a piece of decoration in the room, this dead bird. And it was killed by Arthur's father, Uncle Arthur. So there's comedy here. It's the whole scene. I think I have the word written down somewhere. I don't have it written down. The whole scene is it's in the notes. It's in the, after this poem, there's I don't have this for every poem, but there's a detailed note on the poem. It's kind of farcical, but the point is that she's in the presence of death. She's in the presence of death with her cousin's body being laid out, but she's also in the presence of death with the bird. And the bird, its life is not respected because it's now a piece of decoration. It's now, a piece of art is probably the wrong word, but it's certainly there in the room as a piece of decoration. And there's no dignity for that bird. There's no value in that bird's life. The value is in it as a stuffed animal. Now, what's the meaning of that? Is Bishop thinking about the essential meaninglessness of life? Perhaps she is. Perhaps she's thinking of the idea that, we're here and we think our life's important, and the next minute we're stuffed and it's all over. There's no overt suggestion of that, but I think that that's certainly there in the poem. The loon takes her attention. Since Uncle Arthur fired a bullet into him, he hadn't said a word. You see, this is kind of, is that the child's innocence, or is that the adult kind of ironic tone? He kept his own counsel on his white frozen lake, the marble-topped table. His breast was deep and white, cold and caressable. His eyes were red glass, much to be desired. Now, there's a really good example of Bishop's ability to paint a picture. That is a piece of painterly description. And there's no doubt that the child found the bird fascinating. There's no doubt that, she remembers looking at this bird and being absolutely drawn towards it for some strange reason. It's silent, it's standing there silent. She says it stands on a white frozen lake. I love that. Again, white, emblematic of innocence, perhaps her childhood innocence, perhaps Arthur's innocence, perhaps all of our innocence before, we're exposed to the adult truths of life. The frozen lake is where it should be. The loon should be out in nature. In Canada, it gets cold in winter and there are frozen lakes, but it's not on a frozen lake. It's in a room, in a house, sitting on a marble table, and there's something disconcerting about that. There's something disturbing and uneasy about that image. And then she looks at its feather, its plumage, and she says, its breast was deep and white, and there's white again. Look, see, repetition. Has to have some significance, has to represent, white represents innocence, purity. And she says that the breast was deep and white, cold and caressable. Now that's a really good example of juxtaposition. What does that mean? Caressable means the down of the bird, the feathers, were still soft. It looks like you could still rub them and they'd feel nice. But the bird is dead. The bird is dead. So that cold and caressable, it's cold, it's dead. that cold and caressable is striking. It's a striking, unusual combination of words, because you don't usually think of things that are cold as being caressable, and you think of things that are caressable as being warm. But that this is something somehow emblematic of, the experience of life, the hardship of life and the rewards of life, the struggle that we encounter and the moments of happiness, fleeting though they may be. It's all under the surface here. It's why, like, as a pen portrait of a scene, it's very, very well done. She brings you, she immerses you in this cold, cold parlour. She allows you to see the red eyes of the stuffed loon as it sits on its white frozen lake. It's very, very, very visual. But digging down under the surface of the poem, well, it's tricky. And then the bit of dialogue. Remember, I told you this is a narrative, so we have a character, and that's her mother, and we have dialogue. And her mother, again, who's a very, very, very fractious figure in her life. Fractious is the wrong word. It sounds like there was conflict between them. The source of much anguish. I'm sure you know the story already, but Bishop's mother was completely, sideswiped by the death of her husband. She was young. She was in love. She just had a baby. Her husband died. She never recovered from it. She had a breakdown, and mother and child were separated for most of the child's life, and certainly most of, if not all of, Bishop's adult life. When her mother was in a um, in a care home for people with mental health issues. So, "Come," said my mother, "come and say goodbye to your little cousin Arthur." I was lifted up and given a lily of the valley to put in Arthur's hand. It's a beautifully drawn moment. The lily of the valley is a flower. It's representative of sadness and loss. And so she was being taught by her mother, by the people, the adults around, this is how we mourn. We come to this place, we don't say anything, we're stuffed, we're quiet, and then we put the flower down, and that's how we express emotion. Arthur's coffin was, and this is probably the most famous line from the whole poem, "a little frosted cake." I have that highlighted there if you want to learn it. It's up to you. I don't mind. It's certainly, as I say, I have never taught this poem, so I wouldn't have strong feelings about which quote you learn. "And the red-eyed loon eyed it from his white frozen lake." And so we have this again, kind of, there's that word, I knew the word farcical was there, this kind of ridiculous farcical scene where there's this terrible, terrible tragedy. A child has died, the little cousin Arthur has died, another child is being exposed to the brutal reality of life. She's lifted up, she's too small to put the flower in the coffin herself. That'll show you how small she was. And at the same time, in this room, the adults are unable to express emotions. They're unable to talk, unwilling to talk. And there's this bird sitting on its, marble countertop, this stuffed bird with its red eyes that has the fascination of the child. And then the description of Arthur, which is quite moving. Arthur was very small. That's like an unbelievable tragedy. He was all white, and there's that word white, like a doll. Lovely little simile. And again, a doll is not real. Like, children play with dolls. They don't. They sometimes they struggle to differentiate between, like, the fact that the doll is just a toy, or is it something that's really important to them. So that she's capturing that sense of unreality that you have as a child. You don't really understand the profound truths of life, the scale and extent of the loss of a child. So she thinks of her like a doll that hadn't been painted yet. So he's all pale. Jack Frost had started to paint him the way he always painted. And then this little joke, the maple leaf, forever. So, I mean, there's humour there. That's, maple leaf is the symbol of Canada. The little forever is a kind of a memory of her identity when she was living in Canada for a while, and the Canadian pride. But the little joke, it sits in such stark contrast with it's the death of a child, the funeral of a child, that the whole scene is ridiculous and farcical, because Bishop as a child didn't really understand what was happening. He had just begun on his hair, a few red strokes, and then Jack Frost had dropped the brush and left him white forever. And I think that's really, really interesting. The child is left white forever. And of course, if white symbolizes innocence, then he's innocent forever because he died. And that's unbelievably tragic. And the child observer, Bishop, is aware that he's dead, but isn't aware of the profundity of that death, of that loss. She's not really able to process it, but she is aware of it. But the adults around are powerfully aware of it. They just don't express any emotion about it. And then she looks back up at the wall. The gracious royal couples were warm in red and ermine. So the royals in the pictures were, wearing furs, looking very regal. Their feet were well wrapped up in the ladies' ermine trains. Ermine is the fur of an animal. I think it's a stoat, could be wrong. It's not a pine marten, I can't remember. They invited Arthur to be the smallest page at court. But how could Arthur go, clutching his tiny lily, with his eyes shut up so tight, and the roads deep in snow? And that is, of course, the most important part of the poem. It is a question. It is not a question that requires an answer. The poem ends with that rhetorical question. And don't forget, a rhetorical question is not necessarily a question to which you know the answer before you ask it. It's a question in which you're not trying to elicit an answer. You're asking it because you're trying to focus the mind on a particular issue. We have this lovely image of the child maybe imagining that Arthur's gone off to join the kings and queens, that when Arthur goes to heaven, he will be invited to be the smallest page at court, a page boy, a noble boy. There's this lovely innocence, this lovely imagining that Arthur's life might be over, but his existence isn't, and he'll have a better life after death. That's there. But of course, we don't know whether it is. And that's why the poem has to end with a question mark. Bishop doesn't know whether there's anything after life. So all she knows is the immense sadness of Arthur going, and that image of him clutching his tiny lily, and the lily symbol, fragile and beautiful as it is, emblematic of Arthur's life. The lily representative of death and loss, emblematic of Arthur's tragedy. And we have this very, very, very sad ending of Arthur with his eyes shut up so tight, and outside the roads deep in snow. And that reminds us of the cold, cold atmosphere of the scene and the emotional atmosphere that the poet felt at the time. So it's a memory poem. It's, on one hand, very simple, tells a story of a child attending her cousin's funeral, not understanding the gravity of the situation, being distracted by this loon, being fascinated by the sight of her cousin, but not really, struggling to process because she's so young, the extent of as I keep on saying, I apologize for repeating myself, the tragedy of the loss of his life. That's all there, but it's much, much deeper than that. It's about a child's awareness of death without really being able to process it. It's about Bishop being surrounded by death from an early age, not really understanding it, but knowing it's there. And I think that's the most important thing for me about this poem. It's about her awareness of death, her awareness of mortality, something that was always in the background for her, whether it was, as a child going to Arthur's funeral, seeing the stuffed loon, not fully understanding that the reality of what it means, but always as she grows conscious of the fact that death, her father's death, has had a profound impact on her life. So as I say, if I'm writing about Bishop in the Leaving Cert, I'm not writing about that poem. I just don't think it stacks up against really any of the other poems by Bishop on the course. But I hope that my analysis of the poem is of use to you. Marry it to what your teacher's talking to you about. Read the notes that I've written for you on that poem, and hopefully if you go into the exam and she comes up, you might do well writing about it.